Doug DeMuro recently released Cars and Bids, an auction website that focuses on modern, interesting cars. I'm going to go over that website and give you my views from the perspective of someone who is a finance professor, but also an angel investor, an advisor to a hedge fund, and someone who has a finance PhD, and has published multiple peer-reviewed finance articles. So I know quite a bit about finance, albeit rather less about cars. I am, however, interested in cars. I own a Lamborghini Gallardo and a Porsche Cayenne, so I know a little bit about cars, but a lot more about finance. And I'm going to give you my thoughts about the auction website and some issues that might arise in it. Now, before we get there, if you have any thoughts about Cars and Bids, drop those in the comments below, or more generally, if you have any comments about auctions for cars, it would be great to hear about those. Otherwise, it would be wonderful if you click the like and subscribe buttons. Alright, so let's do a bit of a brief overview about Cars and Bids. It was recently released. Doug DeMuro created this, obviously in conjunction with some other people who helped design the auction website. It basically focuses on modern, interesting cars. That, of course, is rather broad and can encompass a lot of different types of cars. So, for example, Doug DeMuro is auctioning his AMG wagon on Cars and Bids, but there's also a Porsche 911 there, amongst other things. So some interesting models. It appears that they're shying away from the really classic cars and shying away from the super high-end cars. However, I'm sure they would accept those onto the website. A point of differentiation is they have a relatively low buyer's fee. Now, of course, I say relatively low here. The buyer's fees for cars tend not to be super high. So I'm based in Australia. The buyer's fees in Australia will vary a bit, but are generally a little bit over 5%. In Cars and Bids, it's about 4 and a little bit percent. The seller's fees are relatively low, and it's a relatively easy process to go about putting a car on there. However, of course, they do have to approve the car to be listed. Once that's approved, one obviously has to have a description, give information about the state of the car, any damage it has, and the like. Obviously, if one fails to disclose damage on the car, then one is liable to perhaps being sued and the like for false and misleading conduct, depending on the jurisdiction you're exactly selling it in. So obviously there's going to be some jurisdictional variation there. Nevertheless, that's effectively how it works. Like an ordinary auction website, one can think of it as being like to some extent eBay, but significantly better organized, and to my mind, much more trustworthy than somewhere like eBay if I were to go and look for cars. And it's obviously a little bit more focused. Now, in the United States, it fills a niche. Its niche is basically in that interesting segment that involves cars that are interesting and somewhat unique, but aren't at the super high end, such that they would go into Sotheby's or something along those lines. So therefore, it's filling a market gap. Outside of the United States, many auction websites do, however, fill that gap. So in Australia, I can think of several that will run auctions in that area, i.e., for example, Pickles, Mannheim, Lloyd's, Gray's, Shannon's. They'll all have different auctions at various points in time that will focus on that sector. Now, those auctions are obviously going to be all at once. Whereas on Doug DeMuro's website, on Cars and Bids, it's going to be basically staggered, so those auctions will end at different times. Whereas on those websites, the auctions are generally going to be at one point in time. But in Australia, there are several auction websites where you can get cars like this. So I've not infrequently seen Ferraris and Lamborghinis come up at these auction websites. And these aren't super high-end websites, they're just ordinary websites. And they'll have Porsches and various other cars. So it's not as if you won't get unique, interesting cars. Shannon's in particular has some really interesting cars that come up for auction. So the concept behind Cars and Bids is not in any way unfamiliar outside of the United States. Now, having a look over Cars and Bids, we can see some issues that arise in any of these auctions, and they give you an idea about why I wouldn't sell my Lamborghini via these auctions. And they basically come down to problems that are faced when you're trying to buy a car via auction. You've got a few things. You have liquidity, which is basically how many bidders are in the market. You have information asymmetry, which is basically how difficult it is for you to get information. And you have signaling issues, i.e. what does the fact of you putting the car onto an auction signal about the quality of that car and or your ability to actually sell it. So let's look through all of these issues, which are the predominant problems that come up when you're selling a car at auction, and see to what extent, if at all, Cars and Bids addresses these. The first one is liquidity. Now, liquidity basically refers to how many buyers are going to be in the market. In a technical sense, it refers to your ability to quickly and easily sell your item for a fair value. Here the item is a car. and to a large extent in an auction, that's going to depend on how many active bidders you get. At this point in time, Cars and Bids doesn't have many cars for offer. That means that there's buyer attention being spread across relatively few cars. However, in the United States, auction markets have been less prolific than outside of the United States. As an example, in Australia, almost all high-end properties, that is real estate, is sold via an auction. It's an extremely common method to sell property. It is not at all frowned upon. It's very usual. Whereas in the United States, you get fewer property auctions, and therefore there are fewer eyes that are going to be on auctions in general terms. As such, you have fewer buyers who are perhaps looking to transact in that type of manner. You also have the issue that arises with many of these cars in terms of financing, in that some buyers are going to want to finance that purchase. Now that runs into a problem. The reason it runs into a problem is that getting the financing up and running in an auction is actually a little bit more difficult than with a private sale. Sometimes with the auctions, these things are sold unregistered, sometimes they're sold under very tight time limits, sometimes it's just not possible to get the financing organized. So you automatically are going to face fewer buyers than in a private sector or in a private sale. As such, you will end up with fewer buyers and therefore the price can be somewhat depressed. Now, Cars and Bids doesn't at the moment have a great solution to that. However, it is going through quite an advertising phase at the moment, which might help to resolve it. So that factor could help be improved over the time, but at the moment it is an issue that will give me pause about putting a car onto Cars and Bids. The second issue is information asymmetry. Information asymmetry refers to the issue where the seller of the car has more information about its state than does the buyer. It's the classic lemons problem, where people are fearful about buying a lemon in a used car market. Now that exists across all markets, whether you're looking at stocks, bonds, any form of item. In a car section, it's sort of referring to, well, do you know any information about the car? Do you know what state it's in? Do you know the service history? Do you know if it's falling apart? Or whatever the case might be. That's always a problem with auctions, which is why at many auctions the prices tend to be depressed under private sales, because there's less time and ability to actually inspect the underlying item. The Cars and Bids website does a much better job at mitigating the information asymmetry than many other auction websites. The reason it does a better job is severalfold. Firstly, they're always going to give you various reports about the car. They state that that's going to be intrinsic to the sale process, so that's provided. That's often going to be doable through other auction websites, so I'm not saying that that's a unique selling point here, but it's important to have. They also have various pictures and the like, but also they have the ability for people to ask comments and ask questions about the car. On most auction websites, you don't see a comment stream. Rather, you just see the description, you don't see any questions that have been asked, and certainly you can ask questions, but you don't see the answers to other people's questions as they've been asked. That's a unique portion of this website that significantly helps to get some sales across the ground. Now, having looked through the website, there are a couple of issues, however, in terms of information asymmetry, where they could improve how Cars and Bids operates. Firstly, the comments section can just be filled with random crap that's completely irrelevant, no buyer actually cares about, it's just people writing comments. The website should probably try to get rid of some of those comments, leave the comments there, such as ones that are actually relevant to the sale, rather than just people noting random crap. So that's the first thing. Back on that screening process, the screening criteria could perhaps be a little bit more transparent to some extent. At the moment, we don't know for sure what cars are weeded in and weeded out, but the ability to weed out rubbish is going to help in terms of giving buyer confidence. So put differently, at an auction there are some problems, and those are always going to arise due to the inability of people to actually inspect the physical vehicle, the inability to really get a PPI up and running, so a pre-purchase inspection, and lack of information. If I were to ever sell a car via auction, which I regard as extremely unlikely for me, I would go about getting a PPI myself on my own car, and I would give that to potential bidders when they were bidding on the car. And there should be a facility to do that on Cars and Bids, because that would add a lot of confidence. Obviously, a buyer is going to know that the seller's own PPI is probably going to be positively biased, but is better than having no information and obviously getting a mechanic to lie for you. That's really difficult. Mechanics are generally not going to do that. They might give a bit of a positive spin, but they don't want to actually lie. So it's going to give buyers confidence. So that's the information asymmetry aspect of it. Cars and Bids doesn't do a bad job of this compared to other websites. There's some room for improvement, but it's something that would give me pause if I were to sell a car via an auction website. We can then move on to the other issues as well surrounding some of the other aspects of an auction environment, which involves signaling. Now basically when you list a car on an auction website, it might signal something about the car. And there are two major signals that come to mind. Now that signals could be either A, you're desperate to sell, and or B, there's something wrong with the car. Now signaling arises where the mere fact of doing an action signals something about the quality of the thing you're selling. And this is what might happen when you're doing an auction. So auctions are renowned for having some things that are glossed over. Cars that are problematic might go to auction. It might be that you don't really want people to actually inspect the car, so you put it into an auction environment. So it might have problems. Buyers know that's the case, so they're automatically going to bid down the car because there's that risk. Furthermore, when you've got an auction, there's a signal you might be desperate to sell. Because if you know that you can get a higher price in a private sale, but you still go for an auction, it signals that you need the money. So then bidders are perhaps less willing to really up the price. Now that's less of a dominant force because they're competing against one another. Nevertheless, it is an issue to bear in mind. As such, the signaling aspect really needs to be considered. When you've got a super unique car, so a super high-end car that's going to an auction, because the auction is the normal way to sell those, there isn't a negative signal. But for other cars, there is more of a negative signal that might arise when you're going through to an auction. Now, Cars and Bids is trying to do away with that. They're trying to make an auction a normal way to sell cars of this nature. It's going to take some time for that to really gain traction. It's not to say it's impossible, and certainly I would really love it if they were able to do this, because selling something via an auction is much quicker than going down a private sale. So if they can normalize an auction process for cars of this nature, that would be great. But at this point in time, it hasn't been so normalized that people are going to consider it the best way to go about it. We all hear about auctions from YouTube channels like Hoovy's Garage, where we hear about rubbish being bought at auction. It breaks, it's not very good, it creates great YouTube content, but it obviously gives you a bit of a buyer beware thing. So that's the symbol that often arises when you've got an auction, and like I've said, it's why it would give me pause about putting a car onto an auction website, just due to that negative signal that might arise. That then begs the question of, well, what cars might you put onto an auction website? Well, the cars you might put onto it are ones that aren't going to raise financing problems for buyers, i.e. ones where you won't typically have buyers who need to go out and get financing, which might be made more problematic via an auction. Also cars that have some unique, really interesting thing where buyers will fall in love with it and get carried away and bid over what the car's worth, or at least not be too deterred by being on an auction. So something with a unique color might work, something with some weird and wonderful factor that someone's going to fall in love with. Unique color, if you're really into body kits, maybe a body kit if it's the type of car that's relevant for that. Obviously that's not relevant for all types of cars, but for the ones for which that's relevant. Or ones where they've been modified in a way that's going to appeal to particular people. So for example, it can sometimes be difficult to shift some cars that have modifications, but those modifications might really appeal to a core group of people. If you've got some unique selling point that's going to enable people to fall in love with your car and bid to a high level in an auction environment and attract multiple bidders, that car might work. But it's typically not really going to work for the buyers who are going to have struggles or difficulty getting the financing. So if it's a car that's of the value where financing is generally going to be required, an auction can be problematic. It's not to say people can't get financing for an auction, but there are greater barriers than with a private sale. So those are my thoughts on Cars and Bids. Overall, I think it's a great idea. I have a huge amount of respect for Doug DeMuro, and I hope that Cars and Bids succeeds. I think it could be interesting, particularly if it normalizes auctions as an ordinary way to sell cars that are interesting and that are modern, and it normalizes auctions for cars that aren't just at the high end. And if it's successful at doing that, I think that would be wonderful, not only just for people who are buying cars, but also for people who are selling cars, and don't want to have to deal with the huge time that can sometimes take to sell a car via private sale. But like I've said, there are possibly some ways to help improve how that's operating. So for example, the ability to have PPIs being uploaded and given around to buyers. The ability to have perhaps more stringent screening criteria, or at least the publication of more details about those screening criteria, so that buyers are given more confidence about the quality of the cars, and therefore it avoids that lemon problem that sometimes arises when people are buying a car that they can't see and can't do a proper PPI on. Alright, so those are my views on cars and bids. I think it's a great idea. I really hope it succeeds, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it goes. And if I were in the United States, I'd consider bidding on some of the cars that go up and are listed there. And indeed, I'd consider bidding on Doug DeMuro's own E63 wagon. Alright, so thanks so much for tuning in. If you have any thoughts about auctions for cars or the Cars and Bids website, drop those in the comments below. Otherwise, it would be great if you click the like and subscribe buttons, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.